Marta was a dedicated and exceptionally qualified professional, but her talents were always overshadowed by a series of invisible barriers she could barely understand. At 38 years old and a mother of 2 small children, she felt undervalued, often ignored, even after so many years of hard work. Her resume was impeccable: a solid education, successful experiences in various fields, and an unbeatable work ethic. However, the prejudice she faced because of her color, gender, and origin was not something that could be combated with dedication or knowledge. She perceived this every day in the workplace, where opportunities for advancement always seemed to be destined for other people, less capable, but more favored by the company's system of privileges. Marta got used to the idea that her competence was not enough to change her destiny. But somewhere deep inside, she knew she deserved more. The truth, however, was that she had never known how to change this reality without taking risks and losing everything. That day, Marta's seemingly endless and monotonous routine was abruptly interrupted by a small but crucial error. As always, she was in charge of reviewing the most technical documents, a task no one else wanted to take on. When the typo was identified, she immediately volunteered to correct it, acknowledging the mistake and resolving the situation with the speed that always characterized her. It was something simple, a small adjustment she knew how to make in minutes. But instead of being thanked or even praised for her agility, Marta was harshly reprimanded by the manager. This wasn't the first time this had happened, but at that moment, something felt different. Marta's frustration was evident, but she knew she had nowhere to go. She didn't know that in those seconds, her life would take an unexpected turn. The company director, someone who rarely appeared at meetings, entered the room and observed the scene. He saw something no one else had seen: Marta's talent, her dedication, and the injustice she suffered from being constantly underestimated. Marta never imagined that the simple act of correcting an error could change her life. When the director entered the room, she felt even more exposed, as if the universe had stopped to observe the scene. He didn't say anything immediately, but his eyes were intense, attentive, as if he was absorbing every detail of the situation. Marta didn't know it, but he had been observing her for weeks, noticing the unrecognized talent she possessed. Instead of looking away, like many others, he saw the injustice unfolding before his eyes. At that moment, Marta realized that something was changing, that room with its old walls and faded paintings was about to be the scene of an unexpected turning point. The director said nothing more in the meeting, but asked Marta to stay after everyone else had left. It was there, in that instant of isolation, that she would feel the weight of the future approaching. When her other colleagues left, Marta became nervous. She didn't know what to expect. She had never had a private conversation with someone of such high rank within the company. The director invited her to sit down, something that seemed so simple, but for Marta, it was a gesture full of meaning. He looked at her with a steady gaze and said in a serious tone, "I saw what happened there, Marta. What you did wasn't just correcting an error. You saved the company from a potentially bigger problem. And what's more, I saw how much you've been underestimated here. I want you to know that from today on, things will change for you." These simple, direct words were what Marta needed most to hear in her entire professional life. They not only relieved her, but also encouraged her to see that maybe, just maybe, she really was capable of achieving something great there. In the days that followed, Marta noticed small changes around her. They began to include her in strategic meetings that previously happened behind closed doors. Emails that used to bypass her now came with her name in the main recipient. But more than that, she finally felt heard. Still, the insecurity didn't disappear. After so many years of being ignored, it was hard to believe it was real. There was a constant fear that it would all be fleeting, a temporary illusion. However, the director had not made empty promises. He did not expose her or use her story to promote himself. He just continued. There, observing, subtly guiding, trusting her. It was as if he understood exactly the weight of being discredited for so long and knew she would need time to establish herself. It was on a Tuesday morning, shortly before work began, that Marta received the invitation that would definitively change her role within the company. The director called her to lead an internal process restructuring project, a sector that had until then been commanded by the same 3 men for over 8 years. They had been promoted through ties of friendship with the previous board, and productivity had been falling for some time. The invitation seemed surreal. Marta remembered having suggested improvements in that sector years ago and being ignored. Now, not only were they trusting her to take the lead, but they were also giving her total autonomy to form her own team and implement the changes she deemed necessary. The fear returned, of course, the feeling of not being accepted, of being sabotaged by colleagues who thought they owned the spaces. But for the first time, Marta decided to go ahead even with fear. It was the chance she had waited for her whole life. Taking over the project leadership was like entering hostile territory. Many of the colleagues who previously ignored Marta now treated her with veiled coldness, while others disguised their discomfort with false smiles. She knew she was meddling with a structure where complacency was comfortable for some. On the first day she met with the old team of supervisors, the 3 men who commanded the sector barely disguised their disdain. They tried to impose their ideas, interrupted her speeches, and underestimated her proposals with an air of superiority inherited from the confidence they had in the stability of their positions. Marta listened to everything in silence, took notes, and took a deep breath. She didn't retaliate. Not yet. She left that room convinced that if she wanted something to truly change, she would have to act with intelligence and strategy. It wasn't enough to have leadership on paper. She would have to earn, through actions, the respect that had been denied to her for years. In the following days, Marta started arriving earlier and leaving later, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to understand every flaw, every noise, every misuse of function within that sector. She mapped processes, talked to employees who had never been heard, read old reports, and studied numbers. And little by little, she put together a clear diagnosis of the inefficiency that reigned there. Most impressively, she didn't do this by imposing authority, but by listening. That's how she gained the trust of invisible people, old technicians who had good ideas, but had given up proposing anything out of fear or exhaustion. Marta gave a voice to these people. In less than a month, she had a solid, well-founded and humane restructuring plan in hand. And, more importantly, she had a new team by her side, made up of people as underestimated as her, people who had never had space, but who carried talent and willingness to spare. The first big meeting to present the plan was tense. Marta knew that not only the director who had supported her would be there, but also other managers who were unaware of her trajectory and who possibly saw her as an improvised choice. Before entering the room, she adjusted the collar of her blouse, took a deep breath, and looked at the bathroom mirror in the hallway as if looking at her entire past. She was about to speak for everyone who had never had a chance to go up in that building beyond the 2nd floor. When she began to present the project, her voice came out firm and precise. The spreadsheets, the graphs, the employees' reports, everything had been carefully organized to be irrefutable. But what most surprised those present was the way she explained it. Not like someone who memorizes data, but like someone who understands the people behind the numbers. And there, at that moment, even the most skeptical glances began to change. At the end of the meeting, the silence was broken by an unexpected statement from one of the company's oldest managers, known for his resistance to change. He crossed his arms, looked at Marta and said, "If half of this is implemented the way you explained, we'll break productivity records." It wasn't a compliment, but it was the closest thing to it coming from him, and it was enough to open the gap. The director, who had been silently observing everything, simply nodded, as if he already knew where that was going. In the hallway, after the presentation, Marta overheard an HR employee's comment to another. "She shut everyone up, didn't she? But she did it with elegance." It was then that Marta began to understand that she wasn't just defending her own abilities, she was opening a path. And that change, however small it might be at first, was already underway. The following weeks were intense. The implementation of the restructuring plan began slowly, but was already causing visible movements within the company. The old team resisted, of course. There were silent boycotts, forced delays, small sabotages. But Marta expected that. Instead of confronting directly, she relied on what was most solid, the results. With each registered improvement, she made sure to document everything clearly and accessibly, sharing with all involved sectors. The team she had assembled, formed by previously invisible employees, was engaged like never before. They not only felt part of the process, they finally felt seen, and that made all the difference. Marta knew it wasn't enough just to win the numbers. It was necessary to overcome the culture of silence, complicity with favoritism, and the idea that leadership was the privilege of a few. It was on a grey Friday at the end of the workday that Marta received an unexpected message, an invitation to represent the company at a national innovation in management event. Her name had been directly nominated by the director. She read the message 3 times, unable to believe it. It was the first time someone like her, a woman, black, from the periphery, without a well-known surname, would be the spokesperson for a successful company initiative. She remembered the years when her voice was ignored in meetings, the times when her ideas were repurposed by others and applauded as if new. And now, here, she was being called to represent something she herself built, with her own hands, with resilience and listening. Marta slowly closed her notebook, feeling the weight of what that represented. It wasn't just a trip or a new badge. It was a reparation, and she knew there was still much more to do. At the event, Marta took the stage with contained nervousness. Not out of fear of public speaking, she had already overcome that, but because of the awareness of what that image represented. In the audience were executives, managers, and leaders of large companies, all attentive. She began her speech by simply telling how it all started, a typo, a public reprimand, and an attentive look at the right moment. She didn't romanticize her journey. She spoke of the difficulties, the prejudices, the uncomfortable silences, and the constant feeling of needing to prove herself twice as much, to be recognized for half. Her presentation was met with applause, not only for the ideas, but for the truth she carried in every word. Upon leaving the stage, she was approached by people who moved, thanked her for saying what many felt and never had the courage to expose in such institutional settings. For the first time, Marta felt part of something bigger than herself. The return to the company was different. There was no red carpet, no speeches, but there was respect, and that was enough. The board began to look at internal processes with a different kind of attention. The director who supported her remained firm, but now other. Names began to seek Marta for advice, opinions, and partnerships. And then came the most symbolic invitation of all, to join the company's internal policy review committee, focusing on equity and inclusion. It was there that Marta knew she could bring about the deepest change. It was no longer about her. It was about preventing other talents from being stifled by the same barriers she faced. And so she accepted without hesitation. She knew that facing resistance would be part of it. She knew that change bothers those who benefit from the old. But she also knew that if she was there, it was because an entire chain of untold stories pushed her name forward. Slowly, Marta began opening doors that, for decades, seemed locked with invisible padlocks. She implemented fairer selection processes, promoted unconscious bias training, and established secure channels for internal complaints. More than creating rules, she created space. And that space began to reveal new names, new stories, new talents who, like her, were trapped on the margins of recognition. The company's culture began to change, not with fanfare, but with consistency. For the first time, previously silenced employees felt comfortable proposing, questioning, and occupying. Marta didn't act like a hero. She remained measured, firm, listening more than she spoke. But it was clear that her presence now carried a different weight. She was no longer the woman ignored in the corners of meetings. She was the reference. It was during an informal conversation in the break room between coffees that Marta heard a phrase that has stayed with her ever since. A young intern, newly arrived, said, "When I saw you speaking in that lecture video, I was sure I could be here." Marta smiled, thanked her, and kept the impact of that comment to herself. Because, deep down, that was it. It was about who would come next, about not being an exception, but a bridge, about breaking the cycle of silencing and allowing other voices to also echo. She never forgot the path she traveled, the pain, the exhaustion, the times she thought of giving up. But there, with the warm cup still in her hand and the soft sound of conversations in the background, she knew clearly. The change had already begun. And now, nothing would ever be the same. Despite the advancements, Marta knew that not everyone was happy with the transformations. Some figures from the old management showed veiled resistance, and rumors began to circulate through the corridors. Disguised comments, questions about her real capacity, insinuations that everything was only happening because of quotas or current fads. She listened, swallowed hard, but did not respond with words. She responded with dedication, results, and consistency. The pressure was constant, but Marta had already crossed worse seas. The difference was that now she was no longer alone. The team she had formed was cohesive, loyal, grateful. The new talents who emerged under her. Management became allies. The foundation was strong, and over time, even some of the most resistant critics had to admit the company was better, more productive, more diverse, more human. What so many feared in the end proved to be exactly what was missing. One day, the director who had been the key piece at the beginning of her turning point called her for a private conversation. It wasn't about goals or reports. He wanted to thank her. He said that by betting on her, he bet on something he didn't even know he needed to see. A new model of leadership, a model that listens before ordering, that builds with others, that respects the journey. He also said that behind the scenes, other companies began to seek out the organization for reference. Marta listened in silence, as she always did, but that day she allowed herself to smile more lightly. His gratitude was sincere, but for her, the most important thing wasn't the recognition. It was the certainty that she would never return to where she came from, not in position, but in invisibility. She had crossed a frontier, and she had left a path open behind her. Time passed. The project Marta led became one of the company's most successful in recent years. She was invited to discussion panels, interviews, evaluation committees, and external projects. But she never stopped walking through the corridors with the same discreet demeanor as always. She continued to have lunch with the team, listening to those no one else heard, and valuing small gestures like the coffee the receptionist left on her desk before meetings. She knew that, for many, she was a symbol, and symbols, no matter how much weight they carry, need to continue being human. It was this awareness that kept her firm, even with a full schedule, even with external invitations, even with eyes on her. Her mission there was not yet over, not as long as there was someone else ignored in the meeting room, waiting for someone to finally say, "I see you." On the last day of the year, the company held a simple closing event as always, without pomp, but with truth. And it was there, amidst hugs and hurried goodbyes, that Marta stepped away for a bit, stood in silence for a few minutes near the window of the common room. She observed her colleagues, the makeshift decorations, the timid toasts, and she thought of all that building had witnessed, the erasure, the effort, the turning point. Her name was now engraved in an institutional report, yes, but more than that, it was engraved in the silent changes that no one would dare erase anytime soon. When a colleague called her for the department photo, she smiled and went. She didn't need to say anything. She just needed to position herself. She was finally in the right place, not by concession but by right.